recording. So this is Plato's Republic, Summer 2021, Session 3, Why Philosophers Are Not Valued. So welcome everyone. It's great to see you back for the third session, and we're now getting, as I think I said last week, oh, hi Paul, how are you going? Yep. We're now getting into this kind of core philosophical section of the Republic, which is quite famous. So actually next week, we will be going into one of the most famous sections in all the dialogues. And one could also argue for good reason. One of the most famous because one of the most important in terms of trying to understand Plato's view, his mature view of the world. Remember, this is a middle to late dialogue, and some of the stuff that we get in this dialogue is developed further in later dialogues in the Parmenides and in, Sue's here. Hi, Sue.
Hi, Sue. Hi, sorry. I've been a bit slack.
Oh, that's all right.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you all. Thank you. I'm not working at work this week, so it was easier for me to attend. So sorry I haven't been here the last 2 weeks. Thank you.
No, people were expressing concern.
I know, it's just really busy at work, and apart from logging on the train, that was probably my next best option, which I didn't think was clever.
Okay.
But no, good to be back. I'll catch up. Thank you. Nice to see you all.
I'm hearing an echo of myself, which is going to be really annoying. Can anyone else hear an echo? Oh, it's gone now. Good. I just can't talk with an echo, so that's great. Yeah, no, I was just saying, Sue, that we're now moving into this section, which is famous and for good reason, and it brings forward Plato's pure positive philosophy, not just a skepticism, although there's a bit of skepticism here as well. So, and the skepticism relates to the philosophy in an interesting way here that we can discuss. So, but what I'll do first is, because we've come a long way, what I'll do first is give a bit of a summary of where we've come so far in terms of the idea of the Republic. So there was even stuff before the idea of the Republic, but I'll just give that for now. And so we'll spend a bit of time on that, and then we'll move into today's reading. So what's the Republic about? Well, the superficial, the main narrative thing is about building an ideal society to answer the question, what is justice? The good society is a just society. So what's Plato's Republic starting to look like? I mean, as far as we've got, and we've come quite far in terms of getting a picture of that. He says that he emphasizes, remember, specialization in the trades and your roles in society. So, and this fosters mutual dependence. So we need to get along, and so we do get along. There's a necessity for cooperation. Justice allows society to cooperate towards the common good. And he uses a systems theory type analogy here, the system of the human body. If each part does its job, functions well, then the whole system is in healthy harmony. So there's this allegory of the body, but then also there is this alignment of society with the soul. So this psychosocial alignment is where social justice is personal justice writ large. But also good psychology of citizens engenders a good state. And it goes the other way. A good state institutions engender good psychology in the citizens. And we'll see a bit of it going both ways as we're talking today, going from I'm saying the micro, the individual, to the macro and back again. It's not actually Plato's words. So to ensure a healthy alignment, there have to be these guardians. And the guardians are defenders of the state and the ruling class. They defend the state externally, military auxiliary, and internally as government, or as the government, or the rulers, you know, government in the sense of rulers. So remember, much has been made about these guardians, and we'll continue further with a lot of discussion about these guardians and their education. But we need to remember, as we said last week, hi Kathy,
Hi.
we need to remember, as we said last week, that they are a minor part of society. Okay, most of society are all these, if you like, tradespeople doing their job. But anyway, there is this focus on the guardians, and people in their reception of the Republic pay attention to this, what's said about the guardians and about their special selection. They need to be especially selected, they need to be special people, and they need a thorough education. So remember that Plato is against traditional cultural education, where the great poems are used as an authority. These tell false stories about the gods, and they model bad behavior, which raises the question, well, what is a good education? Now, this is answered in stages as we go through the next couple of weeks. But let's just return here to a more fundamental question, which is, what is justice and injustice in society? What makes society happy? So Socrates introduces approvingly, if we remember again from last week, the 4 cardinal virtues, like traditional virtues apparently. So there was wisdom. Wisdom, the guardians need that. Courage, the military auxiliary needs that. Discipline and temperance, the whole society needs that. Society needs to have this self-mastery, needs to be able to control and master itself so that everything remains in its place. Justice, as we saw last week, is about taking up your role, the role that you're good at, and then, well, doing it well and minding your own business. So Plato then moves from the macro here back to the micro, to this psyche. And hi, Anastasio, I'll just keep going. And then and this is where we get to this tripartite psyche, right? The tripartite soul. We've got reason, logos. We've got desire, appetite, like thirst and hunger, that sort of thing, and sexual desire, that sort of thing. And then we've got this, remember, we're calling it spirit, but it's translated in various ways, like including anger, including indignation. So it's thumos, and we're going to call that spirit. But keep in mind, it has this kind of the translation is quite contentious. But personal justice is about a healthy harmony of these 3 parts, where the spirit is enlisted by reason, which is in control. So reason's in control, enlists spirit to control the lowly passions and desires. And then he then moves back to the macro, to the social. And so we've got reason, logos, is in alignment with the social virtue of wisdom, which is required by the guardians, the rulers. Spirit, thumos, is aligned with courage, required by the military auxiliary, and the lowly desires are to be expected rife among the citizens, and they hence need to be controlled. So having made some progress with the outline of the nature of the ideal society, the questions raised, well, this is all very fine, but what's the point? I mean, is this republic really practically possible? So Socrates replies to say, well, yes, it's an ideal. It's a paradigm in the Greek that also has come through to English. Something to aspire to. Advancing towards the ideal, towards the paradigm, can begin if a philosopher becomes a king or a king becomes a philosopher. So this is where, have you heard about Plato's philosopher king? He said he doesn't like democracy. He says there should be a philosopher king. Well, this is what that's talking about. This is where that comes from. You know, the transition to the ideal can only really happen practically in that way, in Socrates' view, in this dialogue. So again, what is a philosopher that he might be such a king? Answering this question brings us to an account of the theory of forms. So remember, we went through this last week, where beautiful things participate absolute beauty. Absolute forms are the essence and being of things. So remember, two things, two participate two in itself, which is insensible. And remember the opposition as well, just, unjust, happy, unhappy. And remember the model we've used before, island and sea, how there is this opposites, and the other is in a way kind of hidden and in the background. So this is you know, enough of an idea for us now of the forms, and that no particular thing is a pure form. It's always a mixture of the being and not being of various forms. Okay, so then remember how Plato starts to draw this distinction between knowledge and opinion, seeing the forms and seeing the manifestations. That's the difference. Philosophers are orientated towards the forms, to the essential being of things. They can see in sensible things, in the manifestations, their participation in the forms. They can see their participation in their true being and their not being. These folks orientate towards sensible things. You know, like we follow the metaphor looking up. Orientated towards the forms, whereas other folks will be orientated towards the sensible things, like so beautiful things rather than beauty itself. They see what resembles the real and take it to be the real. They see what resembles the real and take it to be the real. The beautiful thing is what's real about it. The material thing is what's real about it. They're blind to the essence of which things partake. In this way, they're like dreamers. But our leaders need to be wide awake to see reality in itself. So we've got this opposition between knowledge and opinion here, and this will come up again next week. So it's important to get it here. So he brings it up like this by saying, if ignorance is all about what is not, and knowledge is all about what absolutely is, then belief or opinion, doxa, is in between. And he talks about lovers of belief, philodoxy, love of, we're translating that as belief, and Maria might have something to say about that, are those who love beautiful sounds, colors, and, you know, they love a just society, but they don't see what pure justice is. Lovers of wisdom, philosophers, love the absolute form of beauty or justice or whatever, or the ideal of it. And the ideal of justice they see in a just society or an unjust society, and are able to move that society with their wisdom, able to move the society to be more like the ideal, that sort of thing. So if philosophers are so hot, then why aren't they valued? That comes in the next section, today's reading, where allegory explanation is introduced. So that's a summary so far. I hope that helped people a bit more, getting a bit more of a picture of where we've got to so far, and so we're ready for where we're about to head. So I just thought I might pause there, and if anyone's got any questions or comments or reflections on the development of the Republic so far.
I was just going to ask about when it comes to the forms. I thought that the forms could only be observed when you've actually passed through the physical realm. So, as you know, you're as the spirit. So the only time that you actually come into contact with the forms in, you know, their true essence is when you've actually relinquished your bodily self. So, you know, because Plato had this circuit that our souls, ourselves, sort of cycled through.
Yeah. So you're referring there, Nick, to what we were reading in the Phaedrus, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Phaedrus. Yeah. Okay. So let's put it this way, because not everyone's read that, and we'll get to this again next week. There's stages of enlightenment. Okay. So there's stages of coming to see the forms. And so the way I would put it is, I would say that any of you who have lay back with your eyes closed and thought, well, what is two in itself, or what is justice in itself? I've got my definitions or anything, or what is beauty in itself, and have just reflected on that beyond language, beyond anything, and seen something that feels universal or eternal and beyond the sensible. Then you have had an encounter with forms. I mean, we all do, but we kind of just ignore it and we pay attention to their particular expression. That's what Plato would say. And so there are stages, and we will get next week a very clear expression of the different stages. And like one of the stages is, for example, where you do geometry, which we're doing at the moment on Tuesday nights. You do geometry, and that's kind of a bridge. But that's not where you encounter the forms in and of themselves. So in that allegory of the winged chariot, and then also when we get to further into the allegorical section, there will be a discussion of what it is to engage the forms in themselves. And I guess that's the highest stage of enlightenment. And I suppose there is a question, there might be a question here, whether you can fully attain that while still being embodied.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bernie.
Bernie, when you talk about insensible things, do you mean things that cannot be perceived by the senses?
That's right, yes. I'm sorry if that's a bit of a technical term. Yeah, in not having any, so we could say unseen, because that just refers to one sense, doesn't it? You know, we could say they're unseen. So the form of two, you cannot actually point to it, can you, as something like a sensible object? What's another word for it? A visible object, or a tactile object, or an object of any form. So you can you can touch two cups, but two itself is insensible, is not in the senses. And so this is the whole thing about turning around and paying attention to what we know immediately, right? It's immediate knowledge. The forms, there's no mediation, right? So, there's this idea in materialism, as we discussed in the very first class, where your knowledge of the material object in itself is mediated by your sensible experience. So my sensible experience of cup, and the sensible cup mediates to the object itself, which is beyond that. But the forms are the mind's eye can know them immediately. I can know two immediately, but it is not in itself in the senses, but sensible two things participates. Remember, we've done that participation stuff. two things participates it: insensible, supposedly, outside time, and indestructible. You know, like in the sense of a god, immortal. So the idea is the forms are immortal, but the mind's eye is able to see them directly, not see them through the physical eye, but see them directly, and the mind's eye can pay attention to them. So does that help? Does that help, Vola?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay, yes. Yeah. I thought
Fighting with technology.
Maybe I over answered the question. So
no, that's very clear. And I like the term, the mind's eye, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the analogy he's going to start using now next week. I mean, next week's going to be a big week, so I hope you're all ready for it. So have a coffee and do the reading, and you know, give it your best shot. So he often uses, as we often do, think of our language. When we, can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? He uses the analogy of light and sun and seeing, because it is this very powerful and can be overwhelming of our senses. So, you know, like you do, you know, I do often say, you know, I don't know other people in meditation, if you do meditation, meditating on sound for me is so much better than meditating visually. It's very hard for me and a lot of people to meditate visually, but meditating on sounds, vision has this overwhelming priority in our senses sometimes. You know, we may disagree with that, and musicians may disagree with that too, for example. And so, and then Plato will use that analogy. And so that's why it does make sense to say the mind's eye. Yeah, it does make sense. It fits in with this analogy.
Bernie, is just going beyond numbers, would you say all mathematics, all type of relationships between numbers can be considered forms?
Well, yes, I think I've said before, I'm not sure to this group, but forgive me if I repeat myself, but if you are, I don't want to scare people with, you know, talking about mathematics, but if you are scientifically inclined, one way to think about the forms is to think about the relationship between mathematics, and I'm talking about all mathematics pretty much, you know, all mathematics that is used today in physics, right? Modern physics or old physics, different paradigms, before and after Einstein and so on. Basically mathematical physics since the time of Plato, when mathematical physics was introduced. The relationship between mathematics and physics, where when you have a physical theory or when you're trying to account for experience, right, you need to, in science, in mathematical science, you need to make it conform with mathematics. If it doesn't conform with mathematics, then you just go back and you try and work it out and you try and work it out. And so there's particular times and particular little crisis, fundamental connections where the mathematics doesn't work and physics, and they are famous. And the reason they're famous is because the mathematics, the geometry and the numbers, it doesn't add up. It doesn't fit together. So if you're scientifically inclined, if you're into physics and stuff, the way you can think about the forms, you can kind of leap to this sort of sophistication and say, well, the forms participate in things in the same way that the physical truths of physics participate in their mathematics. And one way that Leibniz put it in this 17th century, a Platonist, a very late Platonist, one of the last famous scientist Platonists, who invented many things in mathematics and physics, he said that he put it another way, and this is a different language, that mathematics is the realm of what's possible, right? This is a different language, but think about it this way, of what's possible. But physics is the realm of what actually is. So there's all mathematics. They say, oh, well, it could go this way, or it could go that way, it could go that way. When you're trying to work out your physics, right? When the scientists are trying to advance their science, but it could go all these different ways that mathematics will let you do it, but you have to find the actual way that it goes, right? So the actual way that goes is the way that your experience or the sensible world participates in the mathematics in the forms. So does that kind of help?
Yeah, so you're saying the physics or the data that you capture in a physics experiment is sort of the sensible, it's a sensible revealing of the underlying form, which is the mathematics.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And so the opposite to that is the way, particularly the way physics was going up until basically the crisis in the late 19th century, the quantum mechanics, the crisis of quantum physics, just before Einstein and then after Einstein. So before that, there was this notion, like of saying that your experience, so the data you're getting in your physical experiment, is expressing the underlying matter. So the underlying matter in the sense of the underlying, waxy stuff that underlines all of the forms that are impressed in it, or otherwise the underlying atoms, that which can't be broken. See, the atom is now a misnomer, right? And so now you can't really think that way anymore. You can't, people have written books, the matter myth or whatever. So you can't think in that Aristotelian way anymore. It's very hard to. So yes, that's exactly right. The data that you get from your experience, it expresses, if you like, the mathematics in a particular way, because your experience and our shared experience is a particular experience, right?
So just quickly, if we take, say, the example of gravity, are we saying gravity itself is the form, but the experience of gravity is the sensible experience of that form?
No, it's not that, right? The mathematics is the form. The mathematics is the forms.
Right.
Okay, so the inverse square law, right? With gravity, the inverse square law, which tells you, which Newton used to work out the whole bloody thing. I mean, they discovered that. Kepler discovered he was a Platonist. He was the second last great Platonist. The inverse square law to actually work out how the gravity worked with the motion of the planets. So gravity, the theory of gravity is a particular expression that works in our physics, in our constructed universe, the universe that physics constructs to make sense of it. Because of course we can look at this and say, well, back in Aristotle's day, and we can in the Ptolemaic period, back in after Aristotle, in later, there's various stages that you can go through in the famous history of of astronomy, of European astronomy. They had the same experience, right? In a way, if you think of it, we can propose that their experience is the same, but they constructed their world differently, right? So, and then after Einstein, of course, we constructed it differently again. Although most of us still think in a Newtonian, Isaac Newton sort of way, don't we? Like we don't think in space-time continuum, but these are different ways of constructing your experience. And the important thing is here to say it is a construction of experience, like what we were saying earlier about when we imagined the baby is born, right? And if anyone's had anything to do with babies, knows that babies can't see properly, they can't distinguish things, and then they start distinguishing their experience, and they start constructing their world, right? So this is a different thing from a correspondence theory, where every particular thing corresponds to something that's unknowable, a material world that's unknowable and unknown. Okay, that was a bit of a rave on that question. I hope that was okay. Yeah, how are we going? Oh, yeah, we're going okay. So anyone else got any questions before we go on? I promise I won't give such a long answer next time. Let's go into to the next reading. So there's a turn in the narrative here. So in this section, Adeimantus chimes in with a critique of the Socratic question and answer thing, a question and answer technique of inquiry or exposition. He describes this as Socrates with his leading questions, takes his interlocutor step by step to views that are the exact opposite of what they first believed. They get hemmed in like in a game of drafts. They might come reluctantly to agree, yet they are no more convinced that the play of words leads to the truth. Socrates may win every step of the argument, but when reviewing the facts, the folks he's talking to often remain unconvinced. So we remember back in the first session we did on the Republic, where I was describing the first book, where Thrasymachus has this sustained attack on this exact Socratic technique. It comes back here again, and this critique can be found elsewhere in the dialogues in different ways. And some people might remember in about week 4 how we got to that in the Phaedo, in your first class. Okay, so here for Adeimantus, the point at hand is Socrates' proposal that a good and just society can be brought about when philosophers are rulers. But in fact, those who spend all their time with philosophy become really strange and are often utterly depraved. Even the best of them are still completely useless to the state. You know the type. So it doesn't make sense that they could bring about a just society. So, surprisingly, Socrates agrees. He doesn't object to this assessment of philosophers. And so here we come again to one of these logical contradictions that is often so important in the drama of these dialogues. And the logical contradiction this time is philosophers are depraved and useless to the state. And yet, philosophers should be rulers. How is this? So now you'll remember other times when we've seen contradictions before, because these sorts of contradictions come up again and again, and it's like there's this contradiction that comes up, and it kind of seems in the narrative that it's unresolvable, and then it all becomes about resolving this contradiction. And hopefully we'll remember back in when we did reading Plato with the Apologies, and Socrates knows that he is not wise. He knows he's not wise, but yet the divine oracle, who can't be wrong, says that he's the wisest. And then he solves that problem. Well, this is a similar one here. For Plato, enlightenment comes through seeing through these apparent contradictions. And this is our segue to the allegorical section. To show that this does make sense, Socrates says he needs to answer by presenting an image, or let's say allegory. Adeimatus points out another inconsistency, another apparent contradiction in making this very move. Remember, Socrates was against images qua representational art. You know, he dismissed all that along with poetry. Okay, so he thought, he was saying that art was a bad thing. Representational art is a bad thing, and yet here he is using imagery. So that's interesting and to be discussed as well, if you like. Socrates responds here to make such a difficult case, one must use everything they have to build a compound creature like a stag goat. So I'm not sure what your translation says, but it's referring to a mythical creature that's part animal and part something else. So what he's saying is that, sure, I'm using logic and reason, but I have to use imagery as well to show the way, because the problem of exposition is so difficult. And this is where we get our first image, which perhaps is not so difficult, but think about how this vividly perhaps presents the problem of society that he's trying to, democratic society that he's trying to bring out. And this is the ship of state allegory. Here we have a ship with different groups fighting to take over the wheel. Those that really know how to navigate are not interested in fighting for power. And those that are deride them as stargazers, you know, just daydreamers sort of thing, looking up at the stars. And navigating with the stars is related to philosophers, scientists interested in astronomy, which was one of the first empirical sciences. This fight over control of the ship is compared to how we get our present political rulers in Plato's Athens. And we might compare this with the way people compete for political office in modern democracy as well. And we can discuss that. So, is it, in fact, these stargazing philosophers who are useless? Or is it the rulers who don't use philosophers as navigators who are useless? But anyway, there are hardly any true philosophers to use, because those with the philosopher nature are corrupted and replaced by pretenders to philosophy. This is where we come to the discussion of the philosopher nature and how it's corrupted. Now, remember, we've already come to this a little bit last week with those characteristics of to look for, maybe in the child, the attributes of a philosopher. So they're lovers of truth, they're not interested in bodily senses or passions, they're temperate, not interested in money, not mean or petty, not fearful of death or cowardly, they're gentle, fond of learning, quick learners, and have a good memory. And also importantly, they have a sense of proportion. Now, very few are born with this nature. And only then, these very few have it destroyed by society. Those that have this philosopher's nature turn out to be the worst in a bad society. Those that can potentially do the most good, when corrupted, will often do the most bad. Those that have this philosopher's nature but are corrupted by society tend to be worse for society than those with lesser attributes, because their powerful personalities tend to be given more power. So youth with a philosopher nature in normal society can become, youth with this nature can, in a just society, can become just leaders. But in a corrupt society, this nature is corrupted and so can do great evil. And next we come to an image of how this corruption comes about. So this is the image of the beast. And the corruption by sophistic education, where the persuasion and approval of crowds is important. Appeasing the crowd is like appeasing a wild beast. Discovering what appeases the beast is substituted for wisdom, to call what the animal enjoys as good and what makes him angry as bad. So that's the substitute for reason, appeasing the beastly crowd. And the crowd takes this for what is just and good. What people like is confused with what is good. So think about that in democracy, in appeasing the crowd, in having, if you like, a public debate, and the person that gets the most claps wins, is confused. What people like is confused with what is good. In this way, the philosopher makes the crowd master of himself. Now relate this back to the forms theory. Remember we said that most people can't see the forms. They can see beautiful things, but they can't see absolute beauty. So the agreement of the crowd will never be knowledge, but only opinion. Thus, true philosophers will be disparaged by the crowd, which is blind to the forms. In a corrupt society, a youth with a philosophical nature will be seen to be competent and so be drawn into important roles in society, and so they're corrupted to do great evil, more than less competent folks. Meanwhile, the true philosopher that remains true will be resented, schemed against, and dragged off before the courts. Think of Socrates. Others who do not have the philosopher nature become pretenders to the status of philosopher and give philosophy a bad reputation. So those that are considered to be philosophers are really these pretenders. For all these reasons, philosophers have a bad reputation, and it seems almost impossible to find the philosopher's nature uncorrupted. The only chance is to introduce an education program. We need a philosopher ruler, but we can't get them because that aptitude is always corrupted, or nearly always. So we must select them and nurture them by education. So approaching the ideal republic is not impossible, but this does present a rather bleak picture. How could we ever move from such a corrupt state, such a corrupt state to Plato's ideal? The section ends saying that it will be difficult, but not impossible. One chance is that the child of a king happens to be born with the philosopher's nature and then is educated well. So there we go. That's that section. So that's the beginning of the allegorical section, where we've got into, some allegories about society and about political conditions at the moment, and how they take you away from the ideal state. Okay, so I'm going to have a sip of tea, and if anyone's got any questions, comments, or their own reflections on their own reading of the passage, speak up.
Sorry, Bernie. Why does Plato use such absolutes when he's so the examples that he gives is the absolute worst of human nature, whereas what we know in the reality that we experience. So with politicians, for instance, yes, we've experienced some of the worst politicians, but there are many politicians who do become politicians because they are sincere in their pursuit of change, for society's good. But Plato tends to sort of give a very, as you said, a bleak picture of these different sort of factions and the fact that they seem to be at each other's throats.
Yeah, well, I'll be interested to hear what other people think about how bleak that is. What he would say is that, I think, when you've got that allegory of the ship of state, is that someone might go into that politics, say, look, hey, I know how to steer this ship. I can read the stars. But they will be pushed out. And so then they would have two choices. Either they join the fight, and therefore they have to fight on the terms of that the fight is undertaken, and compromise their ideals because they need to convince the crowd and so on. And the crowd doesn't know anything about the stars or whatever, and so it gets derailed. So I suppose it's a sociological argument and it is a bit extreme, isn't it, to say that that sort of person that you're describing will not survive in this system, whether it's our current system or whether it's Athens of that day. They will not survive because the system will push them out or corrupt them, one or the other. But I'd be interested on other people's view. You do have I must say, Nick, a lot of us are perhaps a lot more cynical about politicians than you might be. So, yeah.
No, I'm sceptical of most politicians, but I do know that we have had politicians who have managed to navigate the compromises that inevitably they're asked to make I guess, maybe Julia Gillard perhaps was, praised because she was able to reach consensus amongst
Okay,
many.
so the important point there is, Nick, that consensus, Plato is against consensus here.
Is he?
Very particularly against consensus politics. Can you see that?
Well, I can see that
because
yes.
that's feeding the beast, right? That's feeding the beast. He's specifically against that. Let's not sugarcoat this.
But ultimately, sorry to go on about this, but ultimately, the best way forward is the path down the centre. So not to the left, not to the right, but a path that takes into account the opinions of either and finds a way through that.
Okay, all right. Well, let's hear what other people think about that.
This passage reminded me a bit of the dangers of groupthink. You've got a committee, and if there are not people in the committee who are not afraid to think outside the square and they just follow what the majority thinks or what's pleasing, you could end up, you know, with a camel when you're trying to design a horse.
Yes, that it reminds me very much of that. So the criticism of groupthink as well, Vula, I often comes to mind when I read this passage. And if people don't know, it's a fairly recently coined term. I think it was coined in the 90s or something, but it kind of expresses something that is probably expressed using different terms in different ways. But it's this situation that you get time and time again where you get a group of people who kind of have this kind of reinforce each other. It happens in science as well, reinforce each other's views according to a model. And then there's all this information that's telling them, you know, that this isn't working, and they somehow message that into their model. You know, it's called, in science, it's called the, you know, it's related to Kuhn's paradigm theory, using the same term Plato used, but in a different way. And then the paradigm comes into a crisis, and then everyone changes, and the group says, the committee or the scientists or whoever said, why didn't we see that? You know, why didn't, and people outside just say, well, why didn't they see that? And it's because they're reinforcing each other's views. And the idea is that Plato here, now I'm, you know, like you do know that with this stuff, I'm never expressing agreement, just trying to give you clarity what he's saying. He's saying that you've got to go beyond opinion. You've got to have these people with this power. You're saying, no, I can see the forms, right? I can see the form of justice. I can see this society, and I can see how to bring this society closer to justice by taking this, and this action, or instituting this law and that law. That's what he's saying. It's totally away from how we normally think about how to make decisions on committees or democracy and so on. It's very radical in that way.
Is he also saying, though, that the philosopher can only achieve this and bring people along with him if he does it gently and without bullying? But I'm not sure that how effective that is in reality.
Well, is he saying that? Is he saying that so far? You know, I don't know. What do other people think? I mean, it seems to be a fairly authoritarian society that he's describing, but you know, I'm wondering how other people see that.
I don't know, being a devil's advocate here, but is Plato thoughts a bit like a dictator?
Yeah, it's a king, you know, like it is a philosopher ruler or a group, you know, like there's the king thing that we've come to today, like that's a good transition. But there would be a group, there would be, you know, a council, I suppose, we might say, like a council of these enlightened people. If you know, like it is good, Maria, I think, brought it up last week, to think perhaps of a theocratic society as a good analogy or a bad analogy, and a nice one, because we tend to have sympathies towards this one and not some of the others, is Tibet, you know, where the heads of the monastery, the heads of the different orders of Buddhism, what do you call it? The different orders, they're the rulers. Yeah, they have this fairly the ultimate power over society. So a dictator or an oligarchy or something, maybe, but a particular sort. And you have this process, which you do have in Tibet, which is helpful. You have this process where the Lama, the head Lama, you know, the Dalai Lama or the Panchen Lama and stuff, that from birth, when they're selected, you know, the philosopher nature is selected by but you know, I don't know whether people know the process that, you know, they get a sign and, you know, they go to a village or whatever, and for some reason it is this child, and then they do certain experiments, and if they hold up the staff of the previous Lama and he screams out, but also various things about the character of the child, and then they decide this is the reincarnation, and so then that child then is trained and trained and trained to become enlightened in the Buddhist. Well, the same, you know, in Plato. That's what Plato's saying in the Republic here, as we'll get onto it. Trained from a very young age, and as he'll go on, he will say that because he separates the auxiliaries from the elder guardians, it's like, you know, training until you're in your 50s, pretty much. Training until you're in your 50s. So a life of training before you then become, you have the potential to become the ruler, or in the ruling class, in the highest ruling class.
I see it a little bit, I don't know much about if it's dictator, but I'm seeing it that it's a bit of like elitist thinking, like he's the philosopher that's really enlightened, and he's sort of the higher one in his thoughts. If the people at the bottom, or the rest of the people, how are you going to get the harmony if people can't see that, or they can't see what the philosopher or that higher person way of thinking?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question, isn't it? You know, there's no doubt it's elitist. You know, it is kind of like almost the quintessential elitist model of society. It's absolutely elitist. So it's the opposite of egalitarian. You know, remember with the gold, silver, and bronze people, and there's going to be this mythology that we're all born from the earth, and that the guardians are guardians because they've got all this gold in them, and sorry, you've only got iron in, so you just you know, you're the cobbler, or you're the wheelwright, or whatever else, just do your job. So yeah.
And there's one statement in there that's unfit for education. In the book, in that passage. So who are they? Like, who's unfit for education? I just wondered what that sort of was leading to.
Yeah, I can't remember the context.
Because it sort of stuck out at me, and I'm not sure whether I took that not in the way it was meant, or whether it was just.
Well, I think he would. I don't think it would be contradict. I don't think it would contradict the whole tenet of the book, of the dialogue, that there would be some people in society that are unfit for education. Because you think about what we've been talking about here, where he's saying that most people don't have the philosopher nature, so they're certainly unfit for philosophical education to become this elite. But I'm not sure whether he would say that no one can have any education, like someone can't be educated to do a menial job. You know, so everyone finds their place, and some people might be street sweepers, some people might be you know, silversmiths, and then other people are the philosopher rulers.
I'm not sure about Plato's dictatorial tendencies. I don't see the Republic as such. I see it as if he was trying to provide society with a better model, even though, you know, this is a utopian one, because in his eyes, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, they all failed. I mean, democracy put Socrates to death, something that, or the, you know, the 30, initially the oligarchy and then democracy. So he was trying to find something that went beyond corruption and having really the good of the people as priority number one and on top of your list. I'm playing, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Yes, go for it, Sue.
I was just wondering, is this because this book that we've got is called The Republic? That's primarily a political term these days, but is he looking at this being primarily for Athens, the Athens state? Because I'm just wondering how it would apply generally, because I can't see it working. Well, it could work in Sparta because that's a little bit of a different approach, but I'm not sure the philosophical nature is the same as it would be in Athens being a warrior state. But I'm just trying to compare different states and how it would apply, not globally, but generically, I suppose. If,
yeah, well, sorry. Yeah, I think, well, firstly, Republic, actually polis is the title. And so it's like a city-state. And we do need to think, of course, about he's thinking in terms of Greek society and setting up states, because they actually set up colonies in a very conscious way. I don't know whether people know about that. You know, they set up, they had been long before Plato setting up colonies over in Italy and over in Anatolia and so on. So there had been, and there are these myths of the setting up of Athens by Solon and so on, so making the laws and everything. So there is very much this idea around that you could just, you know, set up something like this from scratch. I can't remember your other. I think that probably answers what you were saying. Another thing, just quickly, that I wanted to say, that this elite, you know, I don't want to get so much into contemporary politics, but you have to say this elite versus crowd thing, right? It's not Plato's elite, but it is elite versus crowd thing is playing out right now, especially in the UK and in the US. There were very much well, in the UK it's still elites actually in terms of it being in charge, but the elite is playing to the crowd. You know, Johnson playing to the crowd very much so, and you know, making policy on the run that pleases the crowd and then contradicting. That's a criticism of him. I just want to say that broadly, that you notice that's what he's doing. Right, there's not so, and in the US, there's, you know, like Hillary Clinton personified the Washington elite, and then Trump was playing to the crowd. So this dynamic that he's giving attention to is happening now in quite an interesting way, where we wouldn't necessarily side with either side, but it is playing out. And of course, the difference here, of course, is that Plato's elite is supposed to be this wonderful, you know, philosopher class. Yeah.
And do Bernie, and do you and do we or you categorize that because of the knowledge of Plato's dialogues? So what you've just said about the politicians, the American politicians, and putting them into those categories, is it because you've identified them from Plato's readings?
Yeah? Well, I suppose it's the way, you know, I hope I'm trying not to be too controversial, and if I am, then that's a problem. But I'm trying, like, people call it popularism, you know, that's kind of playing to the crowd, if you like. Whereas the elites will say, well, we know what's going on and we're going to have plans, and, you know, we know which countries to invade and not to invade, and, you know, whereas this is sort of like getting the energy from the crowd and then you know, it's a different, they both do it, but it's different extremes. That I'm just drawing the analogy between.
I'm not making
the analogy. Yeah,
I'm not making a judgment or anything on you. I'm just thinking that placing those categories has come because of Plato's writings. Had we not had Plato's writings, would we have put them into those sort of groups? Do you understand what I'm saying?
yes.
Okay.
This is a case where I would say off the cuff, maybe not. I'm not sure how influential Plato's been there. I'd have to think about it. Like with so many other things, like within Christianity and stuff, he's been powerfully and obviously influential, but I'm not sure there. And other people might have other ideas.
Okay, thank you.
Could we say that Plato, going back to what we said before, is for his utopian society was for the betterment of society, whereas these individual leaders that we've mentioned is more about themselves. Why these guardians or these presidents or prime ministers or whatever, if they're playing out their power or their sort of power that they've got because it's about them, whether it's America playing on the people, you know.
Possibly, but I'm not sure. You probably have to look at some of the leaders that Plato might have in mind in ancient Greece, and see, if you like, how big their egos were. And I suspect that it was probably also the same as about them, but playing to the crowd, and they feel like puffing up their ego by getting the applause of the crowd, you know. I mean, yeah, I think so.
I'm imagining that this is why they talked about this, because there was that type of problem occurring, and they were trying to get away from that.
Oh yeah, he saw a real problem. He saw a real problem with democracy in Athens, that opinion ruled, you know, that great ideas weren't able, you know, and great vision wasn't able to be heard or win the day because it was all about persuasion. And this, you know, persuading, it's not so much about what is true, but it's about who wins by persuading everyone that it's true. So you can use emotions, you can use various other techniques of rhetoric to persuade everyone else. Now remember that the whole context of Socrates, right, was this scene, and it was in other states as well, but it was particularly important in a democracy where young men would be trained, they would be paid a lot of money to these sophists, to these teachers of rhetoric, so that they learned how to win the debate. And these people who were teaching this rhetoric, saying, you know, give me lots of money to train your son, because I will show how, and this comes up in Protagoras in one of the dialogues, you know, and it's maybe a bit of a cartoon form, but I will show, give me the most ridiculous argument, and I will persuade you that that is true. And then I will persuade you that the opposite is true, right? And so do you think if all these people in Athens who are competing in the Senate to get their legislation through and everything are all trained in that way, are all focused on persuasion, you can see how groupthink, you can see how, you know, appeal to emotions, fear, and that will rule, rather than cool, you know, what Plato would want is a cool consideration, thinking about the long term, thinking about other things, and so on.
I'm just wondering if an organisation such as the United Nations in the present day might have some of the forms of Plato more as its objectives, because it's got a number of umbrellas to it, just with peace and justice, and I don't know, from a to use that word again, global perspective. in terms of how that might apply for the greater good with the member nations, because you've got, for example, the International Court of Justice and other aspects to the Security Council, for instance, as well. So I'm just wondering how that might envelop some of the forms, if at all.
Well, it does move towards this sort of society, as do various institutions that we have in our society, where experts, right? Experts have the power, and it might happen with the COVID thing, where where the popular leader is deferring to the expert and trying to bring it forward and saying that the expert has control here, but also where you have other institutions where people elected to run them, right? Scientific institutions, public policy institutions, they're elected because they're experts in that field. So that's moving that way, and certainly that's the case in the United Nations. And interestingly enough, because I pay attention to popular politics in the US for various reasons, and for a long time, that that movement from Tea Party onwards, right? If you see that whole trajectory, that one of their chief enemies is the United Nations, because the United Nations is this unelected group, this unelected elite, who are supposed experts trying to tell everyone what to do, and we don't like it. So there is that. But of course, Sue, where Plato's talking about alignment to the forms, and that's kind of getting more, theological than if you like, if that's the right word, than the United Nations would ever get. Okay, so look, I might just bring up another matter because we are interested in all this, but I just want to pay attention to the method of inquiry or exposition, and this idea of using Socrates' question and answer, using dialectic, because this is going to come up, dialectic. We're going to get the education of philosophy and all this mathematics, and then that's just the prelude. The real education is in dialectic. And then he gives a particular definition of dialectic, right? Because dialectic finds the truth. And the use of allegory. So with the dialectic, we've already come across this thing where contradiction is used. And I mentioned that in the discussion. So you see apparent contradictions, and then you penetrate through them and see that they're false contradictions, and you come to a higher understanding. So that's one method that's being displayed here. It's not just following a logical argument, saying, okay, what's the truth here? Well, this is a fact, and therefore this and therefore that. It's kind of like saying, okay, contradictions actually give you, point you to where the problem is. And this we'll see as we go on here, and you can see in other dialogues. Now, and then the other thing is that he says he uses allegory, right? He's going to use allegory, and then it says, hang on a sec, I thought you didn't like images. Well, the word is like image, like I'm going to use a figure, if you like. I'm going to express myself, not literally, but in a figure, in an image, in an allegory. So he does this, and then he says, oh, it's like a stag goat. And the important point here is to say that when we're reading through all these dialogues, to realize that he's not making just a straightforward logical argument. What he's trying to do is to point the way. Now, I'm going to use argument. I'm going to use this playful dialogue. I'm not proving anything here, but I'm showing you. Okay, and now I'm going to show you using images, using figures, using allegories. So do people get what I'm saying there, and why it's important, and why calling Plato a rationalist, like people call him a rationalist, and you could call him a rationalist in one sense that he uses reason, but he's not a rationalist in that sense that you might say Aristotle is, because Aristotle's very much into using the logic to work out what's true. So just if anyone's got any interest in questions about that at all.
You know, using the dialectic and those contradictions. You asked how we found the passage. I find it quite distracting sometimes, because there's that casualness of other sort of bits around it, and I've got to reread some things numerous times before I figure out exactly what that paragraph is about. And I also find, whoever it was who said it, that, you know, you get led down a particular path, and there's play on words. And I feel like that's happening all the time. You know, do you agree? Yes, I do. And I'm like, shit, do I really agree? I don't know if I agree. And then I go back and I read it again and I think, I don't know if I agree with that. Like, and then I look up a word or something. Like, I find there's a lot of stuff there in sometimes, and some of those paragraphs are quite long. But even with the short bits, there's that play. You know, it's almost like you're being manipulated. I'm sure I'm being manipulated.
Yeah. Yes. And right. So this is a fiction, and Plato keeps pointing you to that, pointing that out. People may not remember, but there was a big way in which he pointed that out in the Phaedo, and then he's done it with Thrasymachus in book 1, and now he's done it again here. So, I mean, what's he doing here? It's not straightforward, is it? Now, I'll just say, Dimitra, that on the one hand, we shouldn't excuse Plato for just being plain annoying by saying, oh, he's got a higher purpose. And maybe he is just plain annoying, and some of the jokes certainly fall flat. But thing to pay attention to is that he's actually doing something beyond the argument right here. He's bringing you, he's annoying you, he's activating your mind, you know, maybe even making you a little bit angry or annoyed or whatever, in order so that you are more able to see what he's trying to show, which is not exactly what he says, not exactly what the dialogue says. So sounds like an excuse.
It's interesting too. I think I've mentioned it at one of the first classes that I feel there is a parallel to how lawyers use arguments. Sometimes where you get set up in not set up, you know, where they're trying to present a particular case. There's some parallels there. I mean, this particular section is not, that's not how they do it, but there's lots of parallels with some lawyer performances, I think I'm trying to sort of say, and maybe not to the best, for the best intentions. And I know we're talking about justice and truth, and I keep going back to law courts because, you know, one of the very disappointing things for me has been to realise that the courts do not always operate on truth and justice. You know, depends on who the players are, what the moods are, you know, how much money you've got, how much time you've got, you know, all this stuff. And you know, that's a really core, fundamental, important element of our society.
Yeah, Dimitri, this is exactly what he's criticizing in our society. This is the system that we inherited from them, the adversarial system in the courts. And you might know that other European systems are not adversarial, for example. And so the lawyer, if anyone's had to do with law or attempting to put a legal case, been involved as an expert witness or something like that, you will be told, you will be inducted, right, to say, you know, like, basically the truth doesn't matter. It's it's how you can persuade the jury, right? So you've got to get rid of this notion that, well, it's true. It's, you know, well, it's not just that. And so this system, it's a bit like what Nick was saying, that politicians sometimes try to do virtuous things. You know, you could go into law saying, oh, you know, I'm only interested in the truth. Well, that's not going to get you anywhere, because if you want to support what you think is good, you have to play this game of persuasion. And this is what Plato is targeting here, right? You know, we might think that, you know, we might think after Winston Churchill, I don't like the chap in many ways, but he has some good sayings. He said that democracy is the worst form of government in the world, except for all the others. So we might have that view. But all the same, we can see what Plato is saying. We can see this criticism if we've had anything to do with the law, or we've had anything to do with politics, especially higher politics.
And isn't that where he also says the tabula rasa, like wipe everything clean and start from the beginning, you know, so human, wipe the slate free of human society and human habits clean.
And you know, it's interesting you bring that up, Maria, because when I read that, I can't think of anything harder than wiping the slate clean and starting again, rather than modifying and keep modifying and modifying. To start from scratch, you got a whole lot of problems. Like, it's quite idealistic to think that you can do that. Yeah. But he's idealistic, I imagine.
And surely, Dimitra, for us, it's scary after the 20th century, because the Khmer Rouge wanted to wipe the slate clean, you know, and the Bolsheviks tried as much as they could by creating the Soviets to wipe the state clean, you know, and so all this has happened in between Plato and us, and so it is kind of difficult for us to leap over those examples and not to think that they're showing us that, you know, there's problems with this approach. I mean, the sort of problems you get, you know, that pointed out in another allegory, Animal Farm, you know, like whose ideas, who says what's true, you know, in Animal Farm. If anyone's read Orwell's Animal Farm, you know, it's those sorts of problems that these states can come into. They might have some sort of merit to begin with, but then perhaps there are forces of corruption similar or different, but just as powerful as the forces of corruption in democracy.
And to wipe the slate clean, you actually get rid of the good. Like, there's that innate good or justice. So that's something that's the basis anyway. It's always there.
Well, he was saying that you wouldn't wipe the slate clean if you got a king, like say a prince had the philosophy of nature. The prince was then trained well in philosophy and then became the king. Then you might get this situation without wiping the slate clean. And by the way, some people bring up Marcus Aurelius. I always forget his last name. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor of Rome, much later, who was a devout Stoic, as is found from his secret journal that was published much later in his death. So there are some instances where we come close to this, where the slate isn't wiped clean and someone tries to implement as much as they can the sort of thing that Plato is talking about. And
Plato was trying. Wasn't he the teacher of the son of a king in Sicily, and he traveled a few times, and he was educating this son with hoping that he would become the philosopher king. Didn't happen, but
yes,
he was serious about it. He was giving it a good go.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, there is this this story about Plato trying to implement it, and the story is reinforced by supposed letters of Plato, and all the letters of Plato, they're published in various. A couple of them are published in a Penguin volume, but they're certainly around, and you'll be able to find them in collections of Plato's work. All of them are disputed to being authentic, but there is one or two that people more strongly think is authentic, and they do give an account of Plato's attempt to help implement the philosopher king in this situation.
I was just wondering why philosophers might not be liked. Could it be also because they might be a little bit too precious? No one's perfect. We've all got, faults and so forth. And so being asked to attain these or work towards understanding the forms and so forth for what they are and following all of that, it's pretty hard. You'd have to be pretty unique to be able to get to that stage, whether you're from a royal family or that can be taught these things because that's where you're destined to be, or just the average person who's got the trade. It's just a bit hard even today, let alone
exactly. And in a way that's his point, Sue. He's really saying that it's impossible. It's impossible for the philosopher to maintain the philosopher, to be a philosopher in his society. He thinks in contemporary society for him, whether it's the same for us, it's impossible. They will be corrupted. The people with this nature will be corrupted. In fact, they will become worse than the normal people because they are extremely competent. And once they're corrupted, then they will do more evil than good. So he's saying that, and this is the emphasis on institutions and on education. This big emphasis on education. We have to change the education. We have to change this. The solution is a social solution. We have to change society so that society can be in this form. So it's a massive project, and he's totally agreeing with what you just said.
It's so complicated,
we've got to
isn't
wind
it?
up. Yeah, I wasn't watching the time, so look, we can chat afterwards, but I will wind the class up because I know it's not good to go over. So, and I do want to say just quickly where we're at, and then what we're going to do next week. So, the forms are the perfect model that are imperfectly expressed in sensible life, in social life, in every other way. So the philosopher has to pay attention to these forms, and this is why they're best placed. They pay attention to these forms, they're trained to, and this is why they're best placed to lead society. So the philosopher sees the ideal and tries to bring society towards it. Okay, so this is where we're heading in the narrative. The idea of justice, of beauty and everything, and then we head towards, if you like, the form of all forms, the form of the good, and we're kind of being led into this. And Plato, you pay attention to Socrates being a bit coy about coming to it, right? And there's this kind of build up to the ultimate object of education, the form of the good. So what you're about to read is probably considered one of the most important, perhaps the most important sections in any dialogue of Plato's. So I'm really excited that you guys are going to read this now, and I'm really interested to get your impressions and to chat about it next week. So we go into the allegory of the sun, and in that allegory where the sun is like the form of forms, we we go into this image of this divided line. You know, why is he saying divided line? And this is where we get what Nick was talking about to Nick about, with this hierarchy of awareness of the forms, hierarchy of different practices of science. So it's a big week next week. And we also get, the allegory of the cave. We get the famous allegory of the cave. So it's a big week. And I hope you guys enjoy the reading. And I think last time we did this, we had a great discussion.
Absolutely.
It's going to be quite dense this time. And last time, and we kind of ran over. So we'll see how we go. If we run over into the next week, that's okay as well. So really looking forward to that. I hope you guys are too. And I'm going to say goodbye for all those who need to go to dinner and turn